Welcome to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Before we even get started, do us a huge favor, hit that like button, and make sure you subscribe to the show. It genuinely helps us keep bringing you these in-depth explorations.
It really does.
Today we have a fascinating and, incredibly provocative topic lined up for you. We're doing a comprehensive sociological exploration of a new, highly debated ebook. It's been making serious waves across the internet.
Specifically within the modern manosphere. Yeah.
Exactly. It is titled Hold the Invisible Line, Spiritual Warfare for Men Against Marxist Feminist Misandry, and it's by Conrad Riker. Now, if you want to read this polarizing text for yourself, and we highly recommend examining the primary source material so you can see exactly what we're dissecting today, you can check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy it.
You really need to read the source material to grasp the full context.
You do. And you can also follow the author directly to see his ongoing commentary by finding him at Conrad Riker on Substack.
It's a text that is actively shaping conversations right now, which makes it a crucial document to examine if you want to understand the current cultural fracture.
Right. And our mission today is strict impartiality. We aren't here to endorse the book's claims, nor are we here to attack them.
You're just looking at the framework.
Exactly. We're here to unpack the author's worldview. We want to understand exactly how this movement views the history and the current state of Western institutions. Institutions which the book forcefully claims were once meritocratic, but have now been completely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Which is a heavy premise.
It is! Okay, let's unpack this. The core premise of Riker's book isn't just your standard, political disagreement over tax rates or HR policies. The author elevates the modern struggles of men to a cosmic theological level. He argues that there is an active, invisible war taking place.
That foundational thesis, the invisible war, is the lens through which you have to read the entire text to understand its appeal to its target audience. The author argues that the struggles men are facing today, and he lists things like crushing debt, devastating financial and custody losses in family court, and terrifyingly high male suicide rates. He says these are not the result of random bad luck.
Right, he doesn't see it as just the economy shifting.
Not at all. He doesn't even view them as the result of changing social norms. He explicitly calls this demonic engineering.
Demonic engineering.
Yeah, Riker frames the entire cultural landscape as a literal battleground of spiritual warfare. According to the text, the modern iteration of feminism isn't a grassroots movement for equality. He links it directly to ancient Gnostic heresies and what he refers to as Lilith's rebellion.
Let's break that down for the listener because he's dropped some heavy theological concepts right out of the gate.
He really does.
When he talks about Gnostic heresies and Lilith's rebellion, how exactly is the text connecting ancient theology to modern gender dynamics?
Well, in the context of the book, Gnosticism is framed as a belief system that views the physical created order, and that includes biological sex and traditional hierarchies, as a corrupt prison. A prison to be escaped or dismantled through hidden knowledge.
Which he equates to modern critical theory.
Exactly. And Lilith's rebellion refers to the ancient mythological figure of Lilith. In some folklore traditions, she was Adam's first wife and was cast out because she refused to submit to his authority or the established order of creation.
So she's the ultimate symbol of defying structural order.
Right. Riker uses these theological metaphors to claim that the modern push for equity and progress is actually a coordinated ancient poison. The text argues that this movement is designed specifically to strip men of their God-given dominion and dismantle the structural order of society.
So he isn't just arguing that his political opponents have bad policies. He is positing that they are ideologically possessed by forces of chaos.
That's his core argument.
And what stands out is that he doesn't just speak in the abstract. He grounds this grand theological warfare in intensely personal, specific, and frankly mundane, modern scenarios to prove this concept of spiritual sabotage.
He brings it right down to the modern office space.
Yes. There's a story early in the book about his friend and accountant named Paul that really sets the tone for the survivalist mindset the book advocates.
This story is fascinating.
Think about your own workplace HR policies for a second as you hear this. According to the book, Paul was hit with a sudden false harassment complaint at his corporate job. But Paul, instead of panicking or relying on his reputation, simply opened up a file cabinet.
And what was inside?
Inside, he had 7 years of meticulous meeting notes. We're talking timestamps, project details, performance reviews, every single email chain printed out.
That is intense preparation.
Right. When the investigators came, Paul's accuser couldn't match a single date or project detail to her claims. The case was closed in 48 hours. The author calls this meticulous documentation civilization armor.
What's fascinating here is how the author takes a modern corporate HR dispute and elevates it to a literal survival tactic for what he sees as a rigged game. Let's look at why this specific anecdote matters so much within the author's framework.
Let's do it.
Riker argues that modern institutions operate on a twisted version of Hegel's dialectic. Now, the traditional Hegelian dialectic is the idea of a thesis clashing with an antithesis to create a new synthesis.
A basic philosophical concept.
Right. But Riker claims that in modern institutions, men and women are artificially pitted against each other to create a false synthesis that will always, by design, favor female leadership and feminist ideology.
So he's saying the deck is stacked before the investigation even begins.
Precisely. In a system that he believes is fundamentally corrupted by the believe all women narrative, the book asserts that a man's word is entirely worthless. His inherent integrity is no longer recognized.
So what's left?
Therefore, absolute, time-stamped, documented proof is the only armor a man has left. He tells his readers that their ink is their integrity made visible. He is advising his audience to operate as if they are behind enemy lines in their own workplaces, collecting intelligence and building defensive dossier. It is a profound illustration of a complete lack of faith in the objectivity of modern institutions. Institutions which he claims have abandoned meritocracy for ideological enforcement.
That total lack of faith in the system becomes very clear when you read the author's origin story. Riker is highly transparent about the personal catalyst that drove him to write this book in the first place.
He doesn't hide his own background.
No, he writes, "I watched my world burn." He claims that family courts took his sons, taxes stole his money, and society labeled him toxic just for breathing. He explicitly states that he lived this hidden war on men, and that is why he is handing his readers what he calls a sword.
It's a very powerful metaphor for his readers.
You might be wondering how a personal divorce translates into a manifesto on spiritual warfare. But the author blends this deeply personal grievance, the very real pain of losing custody and financial stability, with that ancient Judeo-Christian theology to create a unified theory of institutional capture.
It is an incredibly effective narrative tool for his target demographic. It takes the isolated shame or confusion a man might feel after a devastating divorce or a career setback and completely recontextualizes it.
It changes the entire narrative.
Exactly. The text essentially tells the reader, you didn't fail. You weren't inadequate. You were targeted by a massive, interconnected system that was historically designed to support you, but has been captured and engineered to destroy you.
It externalizes the blame.
It externalizes the blame and elevates the individual's struggle to a heroic, cosmic level.
Right. He is taking the lived frustrations of the modern manosphere and providing a grand framework for them. But I found this next part of the text incredibly complex because he leaps from HR disputes and family court grievances directly into theoretical physics.
Yes, the physics angle is quite a shift.
Riker doesn't just rely on political commentary. He attempts to fuse physics and complex philosophy to argue that male dominance isn't just a cultural tradition, but an objective cosmic law. He leans heavily on Chris Langan's CTMU, the cognitive theoretic model of the universe.
That's a deep cut.
It is. Let's break that down for the listener. How exactly does a fringe physics theory about self-programming universes connect to modern gender dynamics?
It is a massive intellectual leap, and it requires following the author's specific interpretation of Langan's work. For context, Chris Langan is often cited as having one of the highest recorded IQs in America, and his CTMU theory essentially frames reality as a self-configuring, self-processing language.
A universe that is constantly computing itself.
Exactly. Riker takes this highly abstract theory and aggressively applies a strict gender binary to it. The text argues that men are the universe's active processors.
Active processors.
Yes. According to this framework, men are biologically and spiritually built to map objective systems, to physically build, to fix, and to defend.
And he contrasts this directly with feminist ideology, which he doesn't just call wrong, but frames an actual glitch in this cosmic software.
A glitch, that's the exact framing.
The examples the book uses to justify this leap are highly specific. Riker uses the CTMU to explain why top-down hierarchy is essential for human survival, and he points to SpaceX versus NASA.
This is a really clear example in the book.
He notes that SpaceX, which he claims is driven by a 97% male engineering team, is actively building rockets to Mars. The text frames this as masculine world-forging animus, a group of men acting in perfect accordance with cosmic logic and spatial mechanical excellence.
And he uses NASA as the antithesis. The author heavily criticizes modern NASA for focusing on diversity quotas, inclusive language guides, and sensitivity workshops.
Which he says ruins the mission.
Right. He argues this directly results in scrub launches, bureaucratic stagnation, and a failure to innovate. The sociological argument being made here is that when you ignore the biological, and in his view, cosmic reality of male excellence in favor of socially engineered equity, the system literally stops working.
The processors are being throttled by a virus.
Right.
To further cement this idea of an objective binary, he grounds his argument not just in physics, but by returning to ancient philosophy. He brings up St. Augustine's Manichaean writings.
Another big intellectual leap.
Now, for a quick refresher, Manichaeism was an ancient religious worldview that saw the universe as a fundamental, inescapable struggle between light and darkness, order and chaos, spirit and matter. The author draws a direct parallel here.
He maps gender onto that ancient struggle.
Yes. The text associates traditional structural masculinity with light, order, and the creation of civilization. Conversely, it associates Marxist feminism with darkness, entropy, and chaos.
He uses a very striking modern anecdote to illustrate this Manichaean worldview and to drive home his point that nature always wins out.
Oh, the playground story.
Right. Riker discusses a $5 million non-binary playground that was built in San Francisco. According to the author's account, the city spent millions of taxpayer dollars to create this perfectly gender-neutral, socially engineered space. It was completely devoid of traditional gendered play structures.
So, a blank slate, basically.
A blank slate? But, according to the text, as soon as the playground opened, the children immediately and instinctively segregated themselves by sex and engaged in traditional biologically driven play patterns.
The boys turned sticks into swords, and the girls formed complex social circles. The author uses this anecdote to drop the line, "Nature always bats last."
Nature always bats last.
It is his way of saying that no matter how much money or institutional weight is thrown behind Marxist feminist social engineering, objective reality will assert itself. So what does this all mean for the reader? Because transitioning from the cosmic theories of the CTMU to a playground in San Francisco is quite a journey.
It's a wild ride.
How does he connect these lofty frameworks back to the psychological reality of his audience?
He connects them by introducing what he calls the vulnerability trap, or the double bind.
The double bind.
Right. The cosmic theories serve to establish that men have a specific, unchangeable nature. The vulnerability trap is his explanation of how modern society attempts to punish men for that very nature. This is arguably the most resonant sociological observation in the text for his target audience.
Because it's something they feel every day.
Exactly. The author posits that modern culture sets a devastating, inescapable psychological trap. On one hand, men are constantly lectured and shamed for being stoic. They are told by media, by HR departments, and by modern psychology that their traditional emotional reserve is toxic masculinity.
They're told to open up.
The societal demand is that men must open up, go to therapy, and be entirely emotionally transparent.
But then comes the trap. The author argues that the second a man actually follows that advice, the second he displays weakness or emotional vulnerability, he is aggressively and ruthlessly penalized by that exact same society.
The penalty is swift.
The examples he uses for this double bind are incredibly striking. He talks about the UFC fighter Sean Strickland.
Oh, this is a perfect example of the double bind.
The text walks through the timeline of this event. Last year, Strickland went on a popular podcast and, in a moment of intense vulnerability, ended up weeping openly about the severe traumatic childhood abuse he suffered.
He was completely open.
And the internet immediately roasted him. The crowd and commentators call him Snowflake Sean. But then, according to the book, just weeks later, Strickland stepped into the octagon and absolutely mauled his opponent to win a fight. He displayed traditional aggressive dominance. Instantly, the media narrative flipped back to shrieking about his toxic masculinity.
The author uses that specific cultural moment to demonstrate that men are damned if they show pain and damned if they show strength. It's a rigged game.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
And he backs this psychological observation up with data, which makes the argument much harder for a reader to simply dismiss as an isolated grievance. The book cites data from the Harvard Business Review indicating that white-collar men are penalized 23% more than women for showing vulnerability in the workplace.
23% more.
Yes. The text's interpretation of this data is that if a woman cries at work, it's often framed by management as her being authentic or passionate. If a man cries, he's immediately labeled unstable and his leadership potential is permanently revoked.
He even pulls from FBI hostage negotiator data to prove this point on a life-or-death scale. Riker notes that suspects target emotionally available male agents 17 times more often than they target stone-faced, stoic operators.
17 times more often.
The author's point is that predators, whether they are literal hostage takers or corporate climbers, smell emotional weakness and exploit it.
Exactly. The expert synthesis of all this data, according to the author, is that modern therapy speak and corporate sensitivity circles aren't actually meant to help men heal or grow. Riker claims they are deliberate weapons designed to disarm men.
To make them drop their guard.
The goal, in his view, is to make men drop their guard, abandon their natural stoicism, and expose their flanks so they can be economically or socially destroyed. As he bluntly puts it in the text, weakness isn't a virtue for a man. It's a grenade with the pin pulled.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because he moves from the psychological trap directly into the economic trap. Section 4 of our outline dives into what the text calls institutional capture and warfront economics.
Warfront economics.
The book claims that the very institutions that men historically built with their labor and ingenuity, the legal systems, the financial systems, the universities, are now actively extracting men's wealth and their very lives to fund their own replacement. This isn't just a critique of cultural attitudes. He is taking aim at the tax code and the justice system.
Yes, the most visceral anger in the book is reserved for the family court system. The author describes family courts as being ideologically possessed. He introduces the legal concept of imputed income to prove his point.
This part is wild. Let's look at how he defines this legally in the text.
Because he frames it as a mechanism of absolute tyranny. Imputed income is a scenario where a judge decides what a person should be capable of earning, regardless of their actual circumstances. Riker describes a scenario where a man loses his high-paying job due to a layoff or a market crash, but the court continues to demand exorbitant child support or alimony based on what he could or historically did earn, rather than his actual current $0 income.
And the author labels this a modern debtor's prison, completely stripping a man of his bodily autonomy by demanding labor that didn't exist. He tells a story in the text of a man who was literally jailed for contempt of court because he couldn't pay this massive imputed amount. Meanwhile, his unemployed ex-wife continued to receive state benefits.
That's the smoking gun for Riker.
To the author, this is clear, undeniable evidence of a system that views men solely as utility objects, as literal ATMs, and will use the violent force of the state to strip them of their freedom if they fail to produce capital for the system.
The macroeconomic effects of this perceived hostility, according to the book, are staggering. Riker argues that men are recognizing this trap and enacting a massive, silent economic boycott.
An economic boycott.
He shares a statistic claiming that 63% of men under 30 are now avoiding marriage like landmines. The text posits that these young men are looking at the family court system, seeing the incredibly high risk of false allegations, the weaponization of divorce, and the guarantee of financial ruin, and simply opting out of the social contract entirely.
And he points to fascinating market indicators to prove this boycott is real. He notes that the traditional wedding industry is in an absolute panic, specifically citing major institutions like David's Bridal filing for bankruptcy.
While at the same time.
Exactly. At the same time, he points out that male luxury markets like Rolex watches or high-end automotive parts are absolutely booming, with sales hitting billions of dollars.
So they have the money.
The sociological argument being made here is that men aren't broke. They are just refusing to invest their capital into a compromised, hostile institution like modern marriage. They are choosing instead to keep their wealth to themselves, starving the system of the male capital it relies on.
It is a profound institutional boycott. And the text goes to even darker places when discussing the ultimate toll this systemic hostility takes on men.
Yes, it gets very grim here.
The author addresses the horrifying male suicide epidemic, citing that over 250,000 men have been driven to take their own lives. But Riker absolutely refuses to call this a mental health crisis.
He calls it spiritual murder.
He points a very accusatory finger at state-run health systems, specifically highlighting a scandal within the Canadian VA and their MAID program, Medical Assistance in Dying.
This is arguably one of the most severe accusations in the text. He details the case of Corporal Christian McEachern, a wounded Afghan veteran who was suffering from severe PTSD and depression.
A heartbreaking case.
According to the book, instead of providing this veteran with the rigorous treatment, brotherhood, and purpose-driven rehabilitation he desperately needed, The VA staff allegedly offered him state-sponsored euthanasia. The author calls this state-sponsored gendercide disguised as medical compassion.
Riker uses this tragic case to argue that the system demands absolute lethal sacrifice, from men sending them to fight wars, putting them in the most dangerous, physically destroying workplace roles, but the exact moment they are broken and need institutional help, the system views them as a drain on resources. He argues the system would rather put them down than heal them.
It is a terrifying vision of a society that he claims has entirely discarded its protectors. If we follow the text's logic, how does the system justify this kind of disposal?
That brings us to empathy.
Right. Riker argues that feminists and captured institutions have effectively weaponized empathy to control men and completely dismantle meritocracy. He contrasts two major corporate advertising campaigns to prove that the general public is actually starved for traditional masculinity, despite what the captured media claims.
The Gillette and Axe comparison.
Yes. He looks at the infamous Gillette ad from a few years ago, the one that lectured men on toxic masculinity, highlighting bullying, harassment, and mansplaining. The author claims this ad, driven by weaponized empathy, resulted in an $8 billion loss in market value for the company.
He then contrasts that financial disaster with an Axe body spray campaign that simply celebrated traditional male competence, confidence, and swagger, which yielded a 19% jump in sales.
The market speaks.
The author is arguing that corporate HR departments and marketing boards are entirely out of touch with reality, pushing an empathy-driven, anti-male agenda that the actual consumer market actively rejects. Empathy, in his view, is used as a shield for incompetence and a sword against male ambition.
He takes this concept of weaponized empathy and applies it to some of the most sensitive political issues of our time, most notably abortion. Now, keeping our strictly neutral sociological laws here, we are just looking at how the author frames this within his theological worldview. Riker doesn't view abortion as a standard debate over bodily autonomy or even standard religious morality. He frames the 63 million abortions since Roe v. Wade as a literal demonic scale blood sacrifice. He views it as a direct spiritual assault on what he calls masculine generativity and God's creation.
The text claims that feminist rhetoric relies on weaponized empathy to frame children as burdens, which allows women to completely avoid the biological and spiritual consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, the author argues, men are legally forced into the financial consequences of fatherhood via the family courts we discussed earlier, entirely without any legal say in the life of the unborn child.
A total power imbalance.
It's a stark illustration of what he sees as the ultimate imbalance of power and responsibility, where the state enforces male obligation but legally protects female abdication.
This intense critique leads directly into his complete redefinition of what toxic masculinity actually means. In the author's worldview, the traits that modern society labels as toxic stoicism, aggression, dominance, hypercompetitiveness, a disregard for one's own safety are actually the essential ingredients of sacrificial leadership.
He completely flips the script.
He brings up the incredibly moving story of Iron Bill Downey on 9/11. Downey was a first responder who hauled 17 people out of the rubble of the Twin Towers, refusing to stop and continuing to work even with shattered legs.
The author makes a biting, cynical observation here. He claims that if Iron Bill were to operate in a modern, captured corporate environment today, HR would immediately send him to sensitivity training or fire him for disregarding personal safety protocols and displaying a toxic savior complex.
Wow.
Riker is arguing that society desperately relies on the extreme, aggressive, self-sacrificing nature of men to survive crises, wars, and disasters, but then has the absolute luxury of condemning those exact same traits during times of peace and comfort.
That brings us to the final and perhaps most actionable section of the book. Because Riker doesn't just want his readers to sit around being angry. He wants them to act.
He provides a playbook.
The final chapters of the text are entirely focused on masculine resurrection and building parallel systems. You might be asking, how does he tell these red-pilled men to actually fight back against a system he just described as an omnipresent demonic trap?
His first rule is, don't complain.
He explicitly says, do not complain. He writes that whining is for the enemy. Instead, he advocates for a total strategic retreat from captured systems and the active building of parallel masculine-led structures. He lays out highly specific, actionable tactics for an economic rebellion.
Yes, the author advocates for building what he calls uncancelable wealth. He points his readers toward decentralized finance, specifically Bitcoin.
Digital gold.
He doesn't just view Bitcoin as an investment. He views it as a way to secure the blockchain, and fight against what he calls fiat corruption. This is the idea that the government can simply print away a man's hard-earned labor or freeze his bank accounts for having the wrong political views. He calls this digital homesteading. He also tells his readers to completely abandon captured social media and commerce platforms.
He champions platforms like Gab for uncancelable free speech and apps like Jobber to specifically hire, network with, and financially back blue-collar tradesmen, plumbers, electricians, mechanics.
Back in your own.
He explicitly tells his readers to give their money to these men over what he derisively calls gender studies majors working in corporate ESG departments. He wants his readers to starve the mainstream empathy-driven economy and feed a parallel, merit-based, masculine economy.
And it's vital to note that it's not just about money for Riker, it's about rebuilding community. He details a specific program called the Phoenix Initiative in Detroit.
This was a fascinating case study in the book.
It was a fraternal brotherhood program that allegedly slashed local male suicide rates by a staggering 40%. But the crucial detail is how they did it. They didn't do it with therapy circles or by sitting around talking about their feelings, which the author already established as a trap. They did it with Spartan rules.
The men lifted heavy weights together, fixed cars, and held each other to brutal, uncompromising accountability standards. As the author describes the environment, there were no tissues, just torque wrenches.
No tissues, just torque wrenches. That sums it up.
He argues that men do not bond through face-to-face emotional confessions. They bond through shared struggle, physical exertion, and shoulder-to-shoulder action toward a common goal.
He even gives his readers a daily psychological drill to fortify their minds before they step out into a world he believes hates them. He calls it the 90 seconds at the sink ritual.
I want to hear your take on this ritual.
He instructs men to stand at their bathroom mirror while shaving, recruit the Archangel Michael as their commanding officer, and literally visualize a flaming sword incinerating Marxist thought viruses and societal programming from their minds.
It sounds extreme to an outsider, but it's a deliberate psychological anchoring technique. He is trying to instill a sense of divine militarism in his readers, making them feel like soldiers waking up for a holy war every single morning, replacing despair with martial purpose.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author's ultimate historical metaphor for his readers is Nehemiah's builders from the Old Testament. When Nehemiah was rebuilding the ruined walls of Jerusalem, his men were under constant daily threat of attack from surrounding enemies. So they didn't just build. They worked with a trowel for building in one hand and a drawn sword for fighting in the other.
A trowel in one hand, a sword in the other. That is the exact image Conrad Riker wants his readers to walk away with. To briefly recap, Hold the Invisible Line presents an intense, unapologetic worldview. It is a highly controversial fusion of modern red pill grievances, ancient Judeo-Christian theology, and a direct call for total institutional rebellion.
It tells men that they are not broken, but that the world around them is, and that it is their divine duty to conquer it and rebuild it.
Exactly.
It is a text engineered from the ground up to validate the deepest, most profound frustrations of the modern manosphere, while offering them a path of resistance that feels both ancient and completely righteous.
Which leaves us with a provocative thought for you to ponder as we wrap up today's deep dive. Regardless of where you stand politically or what you think of the author's massive theological leaps regarding physics and ancient heresies, we have to look at the undeniable reality of the audience this book is resonating with.
You can't ignore the numbers.
If a massive growing segment of the male population feels this deeply alienated from the foundational institutions of our society, from marriage, from higher education, from the legal system, and if they view these institutions not as flawed systems to be gently reformed, but as literal demonic battlegrounds to be defeated and abandoned,
Right.
what does that mean for the future cohesion of our society? Can a culture actually survive when its foundational narratives and institutions are fundamentally fractured across gender lines? It is something you really have to think about because these parallel systems are already being built.
It is arguably the defining sociological question of our current era. When men begin building parallel economies and communities because the mainstream systems are deemed irrevocably hostile, you are looking at the precursor to profound, unavoidable societal shifts.
Absolutely. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Remember, if you want to explore the source text firsthand and see exactly how the author constructs these arguments, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy Hold the Invisible Line.
Read it for yourself.
You can also get more of his direct insights by following @ConradMiker at Substack. And please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.